The macro solution contains two parts. First, I need to actually find the file, which is through a file dialog picker, and I need to make a new folder, and then I have the actual portion where I run through my rows and copy paste them. In the Power Query solution, I had all the data in the same workbook where I had different sheets. The VBA solution will instead have each 50 row be in its own workbook. So workbook 1 has the first 50 rows, workbook 2 has the next 50 rows, and so on. And this will make it a bit easier if you need multiple people to work in the same data set. I'll need a file path to the file with my data, and I need a file folder to store my workbooks in. And then I have a file with the data that I have to work through, so I'm always referring to that, and then simply my date, because I need to make a new folder for each day, and then I can also check if the folder already exists. The syntax for using the file dialog picker is a bit tricky. I'm saying that I'm opening up a file dialog box where I can only select one file instead of a folder. You're not allowed to select multiples. I'm removing any filters that might be applied, and then I'm adding my own filter, which is called Excel files, where you're only allowed to select files that where their ending begins with .xls. So you can open a macro workbook as your source, and then it will be the first filter. .show, if that's equal to 0, then that means that the person didn't select a file, at which point I close this up. And otherwise I say that my file path is equal to the selected item. And again, because you can only select one, then I know the file is always the first file. I want the file folder from whatever folder my file is in, my raw data. I'm using the left function to grab everything to the left of the last instance of the backslash. And in string reverse will look for the position of this backslash, but it starts from the right instead of from the left. So if you have that long file path where you have like C backslash your username backslash something else document, it will only grab everything to the left of it. Normally the file path would include also the name of the file and .xlsx, which we don't need. We need the base folder that the file is in. I'm saying here I want to grab the file folder and add a backslash and then my date, which is the current date, and I'm checking, does this folder already exist? If it already exists, then the solution to this, the result will be the name. And if it can't find it, then this will equal 0 or nothing, a blank string, at which point I say make a new directory using this name as the name of the folder. And if I can find something, so if this returns something different from blank, then I already have a folder and I don't need to make a new one. Here I'm updating my file folder because this is now my new file folder where I want to store all of my workbooks in. Here we need to call a sub I haven't wrote yet in this video. After I've done the actual work, I will re-enable screen updating. This is turned off at the start because you don't want to see everything happening and folders and files opening and closing. Then you just get a message box saying, hey, I'm done. And then once you click OK on the message box, a new window will pop up. So a new directory here which is where you've stored your file. One thing I want to change before I move on is to make two variables into global variables, because right now I will lose the variables when I run another macro and I want to save them and reuse them. All I'm going to do is to say that file folder as string will be moved up here to be dimmed outside of my macro, outside of the button macro, and then I also need my Excel file with data up here. Now that we've already opened up the workbook that has my original data, I can make my load sheets macro. I've opened that file with data, which is that file, Excel file with data, so I can always refer back to it. And I need to load my data from this file and use that. So I'm going to need a bunch of variables. I always need to have my header row, in other words, row 1, and I need 50 rows at a time, which will be stored as an array. I need to know what the last row is in order to find out how many workbooks I need to make, and I need my row count to find out if I have a number of rows that can be divided by 50, because I need to do that check that I also did in Power Query. I don't remember exactly how many columns I have. You can put in a high column number here, like set, which would be 26 columns. It really doesn't matter, since if you have empty cells in the last columns, then you'll just copy in empty values. So this loads an array with up to 26 values. I'm going into the last cell in the first column, so 1,048,000. Then I'm moving up and counting the row, and that gives me the last row with data. I'm assuming that column 1 always has data, and you may not have that. It can depend on your data set. This might need to be another number. Again here, I'm assuming I have up to set number of columns, so 26. And again, this is a bit overkill, but maybe you'll need a higher number, so you might be able to expand your data set. Now I need another variable, which is to count the number of workbooks I should have, where I need to do the same check as I showed before, where if it can be divided by 50 and that's a whole number, I need to do one thing. Now that I know how many files I need, I can close my original file of Excel file with data. And I don't need to save changes, since I've only read data from it. Just a quick detour. While testing this, I had an error when I'm making my new folder. Here I'm saying make directory using file path, but this needs to be file folder instead. And now it works. And again here, where I said set and 1, I accidentally wrote an I, but it actually needs to be 1. And again, here I said data array, but it needs to be data in array. At this point, I'm ready to add even more variables. I need one for whatever workbook I'm currently working in, and a looper variable. I need to both loop through my files and my rows in my current workbook. And then actually I also need another counter to know how far I am in my array. And I'm setting these to be integer because I'm assuming you don't have more than 32,000 rows. At this point I've closed the data file, and at this point I can now loop through. I'll start out by saying that my row in array should be equal to 1. And now I need to simply loop through first my files up to my number of workbooks. I'm adding a new workbook, which is equal to the new book variable. And I need to copy in my headers. And at this point I can loop through my array. And actually, since I'm working with an array, I should use range instead, because I can say it should start an A1, or rather A and 1 plus my loop rows. And it should go on to set. Also 1 plus loop rows. And I'm a little curious if this actually works, so I'll need to go and test that before I continue. As I expected, I run into a problem here, because I want to copy in my entire row from my array, which I have down here. So this is data array 1, and I have multiple values, and I want to copy those into the range. But it's giving me this subscript out of range error. So I'll need to debug that first, and then I'll be back. After Googling, I managed to find someone who solved my exact problem, which is I need to use the Application.Index function. And just as before, I still need to refer to the range I have to type in. And then I need to say my array, the row, and then column, which will be 0. Which will be 0 because I need all of my columns. In here I've tried typing in the function where I say A5 to J5, type in my function, or rather my array, and I get these multiple values. I can still keep what's on the left of the equal sign because I'm saying A through Z, and I just have empty rows in empty values in these the extra columns I've created in my array. That means all I need to change is to say here I need to say Application.Index, and I don't get intelligence. I don't get IntelliSense for some reason, but I know what I need to do, which was my array, a comma, my row, and then my comma and a 0. And now when I hit F8, nothing happened. Now when I hit F8, you can see my array getting copy pasted into my new workbook. So this would be book 3 in this case. Yeah. At this point I need to make sure I increase my row index in the array after copying it. And then I need to add in a counter to stop when I reach my limit, which is where I no longer have any rows to go through. This check will be that once my loop in array value is greater than the number of rows I have, that means I'm done and I can quit this whole loop. Actually, it isn't enough just to exit the for, because then I might keep running, but I think it will be fine in this case because I'm exiting. Now my loop in array is going to be 2, which is less than 1,000, so I'll just cheat a bit. Now it's 1001, which is greater than the row count, and I will exit my for. But now I go back down here to the loop files. But that would be fine because in this case I would be on the 20th, so the last one, my last workbook, and then this exit for will bring me down here, and I'm on my final number of workbooks, if that makes sense. So when this condition is met, it will just quit, and this is another way to say I should just stop when I've passed the last row. But now I'm done with this part. I just had to do some checks to make sure my Application.Index function worked. At this point I am now done with copying 50 rows or less, and I need to save. First I can add some auto fitting to make it look nice. Here I need to check if I already have a file with this name. This might be the case if you run this macro multiple times in one day. I don't want you to override a workbook. Here I want to give my user a chance to say if they do want to override or not. which means I need another variable. I'm making the no button the default. In other words, if you just press escape, you will hit that button. So this is a little design trick because the user probably doesn't want to override. I'm saying if the user does choose to override, then it will remove the alerts, you will save as, and then overwrite the file and then turn back on alerts. Because if alerts are on, then when you try to overwrite a file, you'll get a message telling you, hey, are you sure you want to do this? But you already confirmed that up here. And then of course, if the file doesn't already exist, if the file doesn't already exist, then we can just save it as normal, and I can just copy that part. And that should be fine. Yeah, that should actually be fine. And at this point I can try to run it, but because I don't want to loop through 20 times, I'm going to actually no, I'll just do that, and then we can see how long that takes. If we add in another variable, so I'm checking what the current time is right at the start, and then it will print in the immediate window what the current time is minus what it was at the start. And now I can also see if I've made mistakes, which I probably have somewhere. That's what happens when you do things live. And I definitely need to add in a button. That would be the button, and that's perfectly fine. We'll save that. Click on OK. Find my file. Variable not defined. That is because my start variable is not it's not a public variable. It would need to be up here. And now we can also check what happens if I've already saved a folder. See what happens then. As you can see here, I forgot to add in that you should close after saving as, which means I have all of these open files. And when we go into my workbook, this is where I have my file. I've created a new folder with the current date, and I have all my files in here. Which means all I need to add now is that when you save it, the file, you should also close it. Which should be done after this, right before the next, because it needs to happen no matter what happens, no matter whether you save as or you don't save it. I'm saying that save changes should be false, because if you haven't already saved a file with that name, then that will be created. If you already have a file with that name and you choose to overwrite it, you've already saved it. And if you don't want to save it because you already have a file with that name, then it should just close without saving. I'll delete the original folder that I just made, so you can see both how long it takes when everything is going right, how long that takes, and then we can check what happens when you already saved files. So again, I'll open the file, and what happens off screen is this folder gets filled up, which looks pretty trippy. And now it's done, and I get a pop-up, and I'll close this folder, because when I click OK, I get this pop-up with my file. And we can see that it shouldn't have taken that long. Wow, it took 11 seconds to do all that work, which is good, I guess. And if I then try to rerun it and it's still the same day, I'll now get a warning. The file already exists. Do you want to overwrite? Yes. Do you want to overwrite? And I'll just stop recording now and be back in a second. Now we're on the last file, and it says done again, and it opens up the folder. And it took obviously considerably longer because I had to click OK, 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 OK. But this shouldn't really happen. If you really want to be fancy, you could probably add something here where if you say you shouldn't overwrite the file, maybe you should actually close the whole macro, or if you wanted to, you could make a new folder and look at what I did up here to create a new folder. So maybe you want to say, if you don't want to override, you should make a new folder with the name of the current date and then add like a parentheses 2. But that's something you can play with, because I think I solved every problem I could come up with. Yeah.